Tanse. My name is Jordan Fisher. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Assembly of First Nations Housing and Homelessness Sector. I'm a member of Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan, and I'm currently speaking to you from Amiskwaci-Waskahagan and Treaty 6 territory, also known as Edmonton, Alberta, a traditional gathering place for Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Métis, Blackfoot, and Nakota Sioux peoples, and the ancestral homeland of the Papas Chase First Nation. I'm here today to provide an overview of the work that the Assembly of First Nations is doing to advance its mandate to develop a national First Nations homelessness action plan. Today, I'd like to provide a brief update on the work that has been done on this initiative to date and look at some of the next steps to move this work forward. There is an urgent need to address the impact of homelessness and housing insecurity on First Nations living in and away from their communities. We know that these issues disproportionately impact First Nations due to the historic and ongoing impacts of colonialism. This includes underfunded housing and infrastructure, as well as social services for First Nations. It is unacceptable that First Nations lack access to safe and adequate shelter on their own traditional lands and territories. First Nations also have the right to pursue our own social development, including developing our own measures and institutions to address homelessness and its impact on our citizens and members, no matter where they live. At the December 2019 Special Chiefs Assembly, Resolution 79, titled Action Plan for First Nations Homelessness on and Off Reserve, was passed. The AFN has long worked to advocate for improved access to housing for First Nations. In 2019, through Resolution 79, the AFN was given a mandate to expand its advocacy efforts to include advocating for solutions and funding to address First Nations homelessness. This resolution mandates the development of a national First Nations homelessness action plan, which aims to improve the delivery of federal government programs and the related social and fiscal mechanisms to address homelessness for First Nations peoples. The work to develop a national First Nations homelessness action plan aligns with the AFN 10-year National First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy and the goal of transitioning housing governance delivery systems to First Nations care and control. In order to advance the mandate to work on Resolution 79, the AFN is working with Employment and Social Development Canada to determine priorities for the First Nations distinctions-based funding stream of ESDC's homelessness prevention strategy, Reaching Home. Reaching Home is Canada's homelessness strategy aimed at preventing and reducing homelessness across Canada. The program currently provides funding streams aimed at addressing homelessness in urban and rural settings, as well as the territories. The program also has an Indigenous homelessness funding stream primarily aimed at funding Indigenous organizations located in urban centers. These funding streams, including the Indigenous homelessness funding stream, cannot be accessed directly by First Nations and are not eligible to be used to provide services on reserve. To date, the Reaching Home program has not had a distinctions-based funding stream specifically designed to address First Nations homelessness from a First Nations perspective and in response to First Nations priorities. The AFN is advocating for sustainable funding and improved homelessness services for First Nations through a distinctions-based approach. Most of the programs and services aimed at addressing homelessness for Indigenous people take a broad-based, pan-Indigenous approach. However, this approach falls short of meeting the needs of First Nations for a number of reasons, and a First Nations homelessness action plan would aim to address those gaps through a distinctions-based approach. The AFN has a mandate from the Chiefs in Assembly to advocate for improved services for First Nations experiencing homelessness and for adequate and sustainable funding for First Nations and First Nations organizations to develop their own strategies to provide homelessness services to their members. First Nations have a unique set of challenges that impact the ways in which our people experience homelessness. Issues such as overcrowding and inadequate housing on reserve contribute to high levels of what could be considered hidden homelessness on reserve, such as couch surfing. First Nations people also frequently leave their communities in search of access to housing and social services, which contributes to First Nations experiences of homelessness off reserve. These issues are not addressed through the majority of existing homelessness and housing supports and services. First Nations are also increasingly looking to exercise their right to care for their members no matter where they live, including those who are experiencing homelessness and living off reserve. There are currently Inuit and Metis distinctions-based strategies being developed through their respective representative organizations as well. The AFN's approach to advancing this work involves 3 phases of work: comprehensive research, an engagement strategy, and ultimately the development of a national First Nations homelessness action plan. The first phase is currently reaching completion. The AFN commissioned 3 research projects to better understand the landscape and available data on First Nations homelessness to inform next steps in the development of the action plan. The 3 avenues of research included a systematic literature review, environmental scan, and systems mapping of the existing programs and services to identify how to better meet the needs of First Nations peoples experiencing homelessness on and off reserve. The results of the literature review and systems map will be shared by the other 2 panelists taking part in this session today. These projects aimed to strengthen our understanding of how First Nations specifically experience homelessness, how the experience of homelessness may differ on and off reserve, how existing programs and services aimed at addressing homelessness serve First Nations, and other information that will inform a distinctions-based approach to addressing homelessness for First Nations on and off reserve. The next phase in our work to develop a national action plan on First Nations homelessness is engagement. It is important that our work is informed by meaningful engagement, as we want to ensure that the action plan is informed by First Nations perspectives and priorities and reflects the unique needs of First Nations in every region across the country. To date, we have launched a national survey aimed at hearing from First Nations leadership and staff, community members, and service providers on the needs and priorities that the action plan should reflect. The survey is currently available on the AFN website, so please feel free to share this information within your networks, and I'll post the link in the chat below. Simultaneously, we have also begun to have targeted individual discussions with service delivery organizations, advocacy organizations, and regional First Nations organizations. This includes national organizations as well as regional organizations in each AFN region. A series of regional engagement sessions aimed at hearing directly from First Nations is also currently being planned. Sessions will take place early in the new year and will be conducted within each AFN region. Finally, earlier this year, the AFN hosted its first ever National First Nations Homelessness Symposium, where we heard from advocates, service providers, as well as First Nations individuals with lived experience with homelessness. Recordings from the symposium can be found on the AFN website. Thank you all so much for your time, and I invite any questions that you may have. Eko se pitima, kinanas komtinawal.